Piccadilly Jim by P.G. Wodehouse. Read by Martin Jarvis. The residence of Mr. Peter Pett, the well-known financier, on Riverside Drive, New York, is one of the leading eyesores of that expensive boulevard. Architects confronted with it reel and throw up their hands. The place resembles, in almost equal proportions, a cathedral, a suburban villa, a hotel, and a Chinese pagoda. Many of its windows are of stained glass, and above the porch stand two repulsive terracotta lions. It's a house impossible to overlook, which was probably why Mrs. Pett insisted on her husband's buying it, for she was a woman who liked to be noticed. Through the rich interior of this mansion, Mr. Pett, its nominal proprietor, was wandering like a lost spirit. The hour was about 10 of a fine Sunday morning, but Sabbath calm had not communicated itself to him. There was a look of exasperation on his usually patient face. It was not as if he demanded much from life. At that moment, all that he wanted was a quiet spot where he might read his Sunday paper in solitary peace, and he could not find one. Intruders lurked behind every door. This sort of thing had been growing worse and worse ever since his marriage 2 years previously. There was a strong literary virus in Mrs. Pett's system. She not only wrote voluminously herself — the name Nestor Ford Pett is familiar to all lovers of sensational fiction — but she aimed at maintaining a salon. Starting with a single specimen, her nephew, Willie Partridge, who was working on a new explosive which would eventually revolutionize war, she'd gradually added to her collection until now she gave shelter to no fewer than 6 young and unrecognized geniuses. 6 brilliant youths, mostly novelists who hadn't yet started, and poets who were about to begin, cluttered up Mr. Pett's rooms on this fair June morning, while he, clutching his Sunday paper, wandered about, finding, like the dove in Genesis, no rest. It was at such times that he was almost inclined to envy his wife's first husband, a business friend of his named Elmer Ford, who had perished suddenly of an apoplectic seizure. Marriage had certainly complicated life for Mr. Pett, as it does for the man who waits 50 years before trying it. In addition to the geniuses, Mrs. Pett had brought with her to her new home her only son, Ogden, a 14-year-old boy of a singularly unlovable type. To Mr. Pett, never at his ease with boys, Ogden Ford was a constant irritant. Mr. Pett resumed his journey. He'd interrupted it for a moment to listen at the door of the morning room, but a remark in a high tenor voice about the essential Christianity of the poet Shelley filtering through the oak, he moved on. Silence from behind another door, farther down the passage, encouraged him to place his fingers on the handle, but a crashing chord from an unseen piano made him remove them swiftly. He roamed on, and a few minutes later the process of elimination had brought him to what was technically his own private library, a large soothing room full of old books, of which his father had been a great collector. He stood outside the door, listening tensely. He could hear nothing. He went in, and a voice spoke, shattering his dream of solitude. "Hello, Pop." Mr. Pett stood in the doorway, regarding with a sombre eye his stepson, who was lounging in his favourite chair. Even from an aesthetic point of view, the sight offended him. Ogden Ford was round, blobby, and sallow, and looked overfed. Even now, a bare half-hour after breakfast, his jaws were moving with a rhythmical champing motion. "What are you eating, boy?" demanded Mr. Pett. "Candy. Mother gave it to me." As he'd anticipated, this shot silenced the enemy's battery. Mr. Pett sniffed suspiciously. "You've been smoking." "No, sir." "There are 2 butts in the ashtray." "I've only been here a few minutes. I guess one of the fellows was in here before me. They're always swiping your coffin nails. You ought to do something about it, Pop. You ought to assert yourself." A sense of helplessness came upon Mr. Pett. For the 1000th time he felt himself baffled by this calm, goggle-eyed boy who treated him with such supercilious coolness. "You ought to be out in the open air this lovely morning," he said feebly. All right, let's go for a walk. I will if you will.
I have other things to do, said Mr. Pett, recoiling from the prospect.
Ogden made further researches in the candy box. Have some, Pop?
No.
Quite right. Got to be careful at your age. Mr. Pett retired, fermenting. Why should he be able to hold his own in Pine Street with whiskered, square-jawed financiers, and yet be unable on Riverside Drive to eject a 14-year-old boy from an easy-chair? Meanwhile, he had still to find a place where he could read his Sunday paper. He began to mount the stairs. Reaching the top floor...